if we're going to realise the sort of offset schemes that we're talking about. So those sort of political and social dynamics are very important to achieve what we're going to achieve. Otherwise, we'll follow up on the specifics.
Peter Mooney.
Thanks for that question. It's difficult if you're going to get together and solve all the problems, but if you look at the two big issues you've done, the freshwater wetland riparian systems in South Africa, select the key component, what is it? Really understand what you're trying to achieve. And the same was with our intact forests in Russia, that was the key issue. And then on that whole landscape, in Russia it's actually the whole of Komi province, it's a very big operation. But it's focused on the intact forests through a multi-stakeholder process. So just to get back to what Peter said from Rio Tinto, it needs to operate within a framework so we can really get progress. Tick them off, move on to the next issue. But if you try and put it all together, it might be difficult.
And the last Peter. So after lunch, there's a panel of future leaders. So if you want to go to the next generation, come back at 2 o'clock, they'll talk. But if in the future we're going to run business differently, looking not only at financial capital, but also at natural and social capital, then it's clear we need to change executive education. So at WBCSD we've started a large piece of work on that, involving as many business schools as we can, and that will soon be out.
So we didn't get to small business people, but perhaps we'll find a way of trying to address that later on. I'd like to invite a long-standing colleague of mine, Dr. Josh Bishop's up. He's our rapporteur, and Josh has got just under 10 minutes now to give his perspective, his learnings. Up there? I'm glad you didn't leave up. Okay, Josh, thanks very much.
Good afternoon. Thanks very much to the organizers for inviting me to try and summarize and wrap up this session. It's been very interesting to listen to all of the different interventions, including the questions from the floor. I guess one reason I've been invited to do this is because of my long-standing association with WBCSD and some of the member companies. Going back, I realized about 20 years. Not just my previous job at IUCN, where I worked for 9 years, but at IIED in London for 11 years before that. We did a big project on sustainability in the paper industry back in the 90s. Then we did mining. Then moved to IUCN and so on. Anyways, that's enough about me. What did we hear, or what did I hear? And I hope this is not too far off what some of you heard. I think Bjorn Stigsen's framed very clearly at the outset what this session is about. It's about scaling up, accelerating progress towards sustainability, specifically around biodiversity and ecosystem services, or natural capital, as some people have called it, in business, and what businesses can do to deliver solutions. And we also heard from Julia Martin-Lefebvre, Director General of IUCN, on the increasing importance of partnerships with business, of working with companies for the IUCN and the members of IUCN, because of the significant role that businesses play in future sustainability of our societies. And Julia highlighted the search for nature-based solutions. I think that's a topic we're going to hear increasingly, not just at this Congress, but as we go forward. Peter Bakker from WBCSD made a point that I thought was particularly interesting, which is that there's perhaps more and more consensus now about the science. I think for many years we were arguing with each other about what does the science tell us about climate change, about biodiversity, about ecosystems. Thankfully, there's less of that. Now we can agree on what the problem is and start focusing more on solutions, and that's real progress. He also highlighted the challenge that we all face quite well. I think that the idea, as expressed in the Vision 2050 document, of how do 9 billion people in 2050 live well within the boundaries of this planet. And my organization, WWF, does quite a lot of work on planetary boundaries. We publish the Living Planet report every 2 years, and estimate that already we're using 1.5 planets. So if we've got another 2 billion people coming, how are we going to square that circle? Well, one of the responses, and we heard this over and over again, is partnerships. Partnerships in this session, mainly between companies and civil society organizations, but also partnerships across companies in industry associations. We heard a little bit about partnerships with government and regulatory frameworks, but perhaps not as much as we will hear this afternoon. I'll come back to that. What do these partnerships do? A lot of things, and we heard some great examples from different companies. They can be helpful for priority setting, identifying what are the risks that companies face around biodiversity and ecosystem services. Partnerships can be useful for setting targets, although we heard some differences of opinion about that. Rio Tinto says, let's set a target and then figure out how to meet it. Holcim says, let's figure out where we are and how we can make progress, then maybe we'll set a target. If I can summarize that, I hope I didn't do a disservice there. But I think there are still these differences of opinion within business about whether to be led by ambitious goals or to focus first on the underlying science before going public. And it's I think there can be a virtuous cycle there. Indicators is another area. The whole question of metrics and reporting is an area where partnerships can play a big role. We heard we heard from both Rio Tinto and Shell that increasingly they're looking for resources in sensitive places, in the Arctic, in the tropics, in parts of the world that perhaps in the past have not seen a lot of extraction or exploitation. And this puts pressure on us as a conservation community because we also have these targets agreed, for example, in Nagoya at COP10 to increase protected area coverage to 17% of terrestrial environments, 10% of marine. How do we square that growth in protection with increasing demand for natural resources? One response, I suppose, we heard from Syngenta was, well, let's combine conservation with productivity. Can we find new solutions that meet the demand for increasing the increasing demand for these commodities while also conserving resources? Technical innovation has to be part of that. And we heard from, I think, POSCO and Hitachi in particular, how one of the major contributions of business is the technological innovations that allows us to do more with less and conserve resources while also meeting growing human needs. I'm going to turn quickly to some of the responses to the questions, because I think the questions that James asked really emphasize what we're trying to get at here. And his first question was around scaling up. And we heard about actions that companies can take within their core operations, raising awareness among employees, training their staff, making public commitments, as in the case of Rio Tinto, and then trying to give substance to that, operationalizing those commitments in their different sites. We heard also about mainstreaming biodiversity and ecosystem services into business strategy and then into the scorecards and incentive systems that are used by companies to rate their business units and even individual employees. And again, technical innovation. But beyond what companies can do within their own operations, we heard also about working across sector with other companies on best practice guidelines, what are some other things? Integrated landscape level planning with a range of different stakeholders. Those are the main things I heard. And then lastly, so beyond working on their own operations, working across sector through industry associations or among coalitions of the willing, as we heard, there's work to be done with the regulators. And that, as you know, is the focus of this afternoon's session. But just a couple of things. I heard getting the regulators to accept innovative use of waste material. We heard that from POSCO, for example. trying to get a level playing field that's conducive to the investments that are needed in the environment, where at the moment the policies don't provide those incentives. Those are the main things I heard on the regulatory side. What we didn't hear so much, maybe we'll hear a little bit more this afternoon or even in future sessions, is around new business models. I think that was mentioned by Hitachi, the idea of social innovation, business models. Also Juan talked about incubating and rolling out new business models in Africa around agricultural production. I do think that that's still a little bit of a missing topic. We have a lot of major incumbents here in the business world. There is potential to create disruptive business models that deliver biodiversity and ecosystem benefits. And I think it's a fair question whether those new business models are going to come from the incumbents or come from elsewhere in the world. James asked about the relevance of NPI to other sectors, the net positive impact concept. And I think opinions are mixed on that. It's clear that there's interest in NPI, but there's also some concerns about certain components of that, particularly around offsets. And that maybe there's a need to understand the issues and the problem first before making a commitment to that in other sectors. I would hope that we would hear perhaps more definitive and positive statements on NPI in the future, because from my perspective, and this is a personal point of view here, we do need ultimately business to make a positive contribution to natural capital, just as they make or attempt to make a positive contribution to financial capital and to social capital. We take it for granted that business creates jobs and generates profits for their owners. We don't yet take it for granted that business generates a positive contribution to nature and to natural capital. Maybe that's something we should be looking for in the future. James asked about bad actors, but nobody really wanted to tackle that. I think that's a difficult thing for government to badmouth their peers, just as for NGOs to badmouth their peers. We don't like to do that. And I'm going to end just with a quick comment. I'm not going to reflect on the question and answer. I think our panelists have addressed that. We had a range of different questions around global standards, around staff awareness, around training the new generation of business leaders, and so on. What I want to just highlight at the end is one thing I didn't hear. I didn't hear much about profits and growth. If you were in a business conference, you'd expect business to talk about profits and growth. And I'd like to hear more about how those targets, those objectives, are aligned with some of these biodiversity and ecosystem or nature-based solutions. And lastly, we heard people appeal to for the need for a level playing field, for conducive regulatory frameworks, but I didn't get any idea really from this discussion of what specifically does business want public policymakers to do? What would make a difference in terms of their scale of investment and action? With that, I will close my comments. I hope that was some kind of reflection of what we heard, and turn the podium back to Bjorn for closing. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks a lot, George, for that summary. You will have a second round this afternoon, and hopefully some of the things you didn't hear in the first half of this think tank, you will hear about in the second half. Let me thank the panelists for their contributions, and James for leading this panel. And let's give them a very warm hand of thanks. We now have a break before the second half of this game today is happening, and that's to hear from future leaders. A discussion led by Peter. There is a Future Leaders team in the World Business Council that's an annual program, been going on for 10 years, and you'll hear about that, and from also future leaders from the conservation movement. And we will have another set of perspectives later on in the afternoon about public policy, about partnerships, as was a key issue that we heard about today. So there is 1 hour break. Please be back at 2 o'clock. And following these sessions, there will also be some final reflections later on in the afternoon. Thank you.